Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming to the Commemoration Committee's event today. My name is Dr. Yoon Ha-shin, one of the chairs of the Commemoration Committee. Today's event commemorates February as Black History Month. Before we begin, let me briefly introduce our team, the Legacy Project, and the Commemoration Committee. The Legacy Project is an interdisciplinary institute now in its 9th year of programming at CCM. Legacy hosts an ongoing speaker series for audience members to learn important academic lessons outside the traditional classroom setting. We bring engaging and diverse voices to the college campus and to the broader Morris County community. Past events have focused on a variety of issues, from civil rights to the Holocaust and to climate change. Some notable speakers include Richard Blanco, the second inaugural poet of President Barack Obama, Theodora Smiley Lacey, a personal friend of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and Judith Heumann, the legendary disability rights advocate. Next academic year, Legacy will honor the 10th anniversary of Hurricane Sandy. The Commemoration Committee is a subcommittee of the Legacy Project that started in 2020. The committee is an interdisciplinary group on campus that recognizes and raises awareness and understanding of diverse groups, cultures, and histories. The committee particularly works to highlight the experts and voices of our own CCM faculty and holds events that recognize days or months of remembrance designated at the governmental and international levels. Past events provided by the committee include a virtual tour of the New York Historical Society exhibition called Black Citizenship in the Age of Jim Crow, commemorating Black History Month in February, a virtual tour of the New York Historical Society exhibition Women March, commemorating Women's History Month in March, and a talk on the Korean War and the rebuilding of the Korean community, commemorating the Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month in May. This year, we are also planning to create interesting events for the upcoming days and months, including but not limited to Women's History Month in March and LGBTQ Pride Month in June. So please keep an eye on the email from us and join us as we move forward. I am sharing our email, Instagram account, and Twitter account here. So please follow us on Instagram and Twitter to stay up to date with our events and news. For today's event, closed captioning is available. If you would like to turn it on, please click on the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen for live transcription. You can choose to hide or show captions as you need them. Please also note that everyone is put on mute upon entry. You won't be able to unmute yourself until the lecture is over, but this doesn't mean that you can't ask a question. We would actually love to hear from you. So after the lecture, After the lecture, there will be a Q&A session. And if you'd like to ask a question, simply write question in the chat box. Okay? Once you're prompted, you will be able to unmute yourself and ask your question. If you'd like to ask a question but don't want to unmute yourself, you can also type your question in the chat box. We will get to as many questions as possible in the time we have. Lastly, if you're here for class participation, please make sure to change your name to your full name. In order to change your name on Zoom, click on participants and move your mouse over your own name, and you will see more as an option. Click on more and you will see rename. So as I explained briefly this before, commemorating Black History Month, today's event will introduce and discuss the legacy of New Jersey's own writer, music critic, and activist, Amiri Barakah. Barakah is no stranger to CCM, in fact, not only because he's a New Jersey native. On April 18th, 1989, CCM invited Barakah for a Distinguished American Poets series. You can find the digitized recording of his recital performance at CCM from CCM's YouTube channel. Today, however, with Dr. Peter Clavin, we are looking into Barakah's life, not only as an artist, but also as a radical thinker and influential activist for African Americans in New Jersey and nationwide. Dr. Clavin is an interdisciplinary scholar of American Studies, African American Studies, English, and history. He has an educational background in history, political science and English, and he received his PhD degree in American Studies at the University of Buffalo with his dissertation on Amiri Baraka. He has extensively written and published essays on the politics and pedagogy of Baraka's lifelong activism, and he's currently writing a book on Baraka. He teaches English courses at CCM. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Clavin. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Clavin.
Thank you, Dr. Shin. Let me see. Let me share my screen. Okay. Okay. Let's see. All right. Everybody see my screen? Good. Good. Okay. All right. Well, thanks for having me, and let's begin. Spirit House, Amiri Baraka and the Black Arts Movement in Newark, New Jersey. Following the violent deaths of Malcolm X in 1965 and Martin Luther King in 1968, no one did more to reshape Black identity, space, and sound for African Americans in the United States than Amiri Baraka. While he is famous for his cultural work associated with initially developing the Black Arts Movement in New York City, during the 1960s, Baraka's enduring legacy continues to be felt here in New Jersey. Okay. All right, so Amiri Baraka's worldview is shaped by his experiences growing up in Black Newark. At the turn of the 20th century, Newark was a successful urban center, and Baraka's birth and his childhood experience in that city is a reflection of larger historical processes, namely industrialization and the Great Migration. So from the early 1800s through the mid 20th century, Newark was a successful economic center, and it became known as a welcoming haven with opportunity for people of color. So let's see. So as part of the Great Migration, between 1900 and 1970, more than 6 million African Americans migrated from the American South to the American North and West. And so Newark's principal Black population formed in between 1910 and 1920, when nearly 1 million Black Southerners migrated. Well, so why were so many African Americans migrating north? It was principally two reasons. One, to escape white terrorism, and two, economic opportunity. And Newark offered a little bit of both. So farm workers in the South earned up to 75 cents per day chopping and picking cotton, whereas in Newark during wartime, a dye plant employee made $2.75 per day, and the company paid for their passage and provided a rent-free room on arrival. So, and by the end of the Great Migration, Black female migrants in Newark secured more jobs in wartime industries than in any other northern city except for Detroit. And so between 1900 and 1960, more than 100,000 African Americans looking for economic opportunities and relief from Jim Crow laws moved to Newark. And so this is the context in which Leroy Jones was born. So Amiri Baraka was born, Leroy Jones, on October 7th, 1934, at Kenny Memorial Hospital in Newark's Central Ward. He was the son of Coit Leroy Jones, a postal worker, and his mom, Anna Lois Russ, a domestic worker and a social worker. He had one younger sister, Sandra Elaine, born in 1936, and Leroy graduated from Barrington High School in 1951 at 16 years of age, demonstrating his intellectual prowess early on. Now, I have to speak to the racial politics of the city. Newark, while it offered more economic opportunity and less racial oppression than the South, it was still very much a segregated city. In fact, the first Black hospital was built in 1927 by Dr. John A. Kenny, and that's the hospital that Leroy Jones was born in. So don't ask me where Black people gave birth before 1927 in Newark. I imagine it was probably at home. But this is the type of racial politics, even in the urban North, where African Americans didn't have a hospital to go to before 1927. And it's worth noting that Dr. Kenny had immigrated from Tennessee, and he was a practicing physician. But because the KKK essentially chased him out of town, they burnt a cross in his front yard. Then in 1925, he fled Tennessee to set up shop in Newark, right? Leroy Jones's, so race was a fact of life for the young Leroy Jones. His grandfather, Tom Russ, comes from Dothan, Alabama. And in 1925, well, he ran a funeral parlor and he ran 2 grocery stores. And his grocery stores were burned down. And so by 1925, he left Alabama, migrated north to Newark. And Leroy Jones's father, Coit, from Hartsville, South Carolina, he, in a movie theater, got into a scuffle with an usher, the segregated movie theater, and he got in a fight with him. And he had to leave that Hartsville, South Carolina that night for fear of the white mob chasing him. He ends up moving to Newark in 1927. So it's this background of racial politics in which Leroy Jones was born in, that would shape the way he viewed the world, and it would shape his own, poetics and politics going forward, as we shall see. So in 1951, after graduating from Barringer High School, he enrolls in Rutgers Newark. He studies there for less than 2 years and drops out. Now, just like Barringer, he was largely unhappy because he was one of the only African-American students in the school. So it's a testament to his intellectual ability, but he was socially isolated. So he graduated from Barringer, didn't enjoy it, but he drops out of Rutgers Newark. He then goes to a historically Black college and university, Howard University in Washington, D.C. Well, same thing. He's unhappy, right? He doesn't feel like he fits in with many African Americans in D.C. So he moves back home, and what's he going to do? He doesn't know what to do. So in 1954, he joins the Air Force, and he would serve in the Air Force from 1954 to 1957, and he would be dishonorably discharged on charges of being a communist. Now, what were those charges? He was caught possessing a book of poems by the gay poet E.E. Cummings. And so such was mainstream American politics in the 1950s, that if you were reading a gay poet, you were considered to be a communist and a threat to the very fabric of American society. So 1957, he's 23 years old. What is he going to do? He ends up moving to Greenwich Village, New York City, to attend classes at Columbia University, but also he gets a job working at a record store. He took his first job at the Record Changer, a record store that traded exclusively on vintage jazz recordings. And he gains national recognition in 2 key ways. I should say that he moves to Greenwich, where he would gain national recognition for his literary work as both a poet and a jazz critic. He wrote liner notes for Prestige and Impulse Records, and his reviews appeared in Metronome, Downbeat, and Jazz Journal. And it's worth noting that he was the only Black jazz critic writing in the United States at this time. So this is a very influential role that he had, and he was well regarded, highly respected, and became nationally known for his writings on jazz. And 2, he became editor of the beat literary journal called Eugen. Now, what's a beat? The beats, or the beatniks as they were called, they were kind of social rebels, and they kind of emanated in 3 main points: New York City, Black Mountain, North Carolina, and San Francisco, California. And the beats, as I said, they were social rebels. They were outside of the norms of American society at this time, right? They didn't necessarily want to move to the suburbs. They didn't necessarily want to get married. They didn't necessarily want to have children, right? They just marched to the beat of their own drum. And so they were very much on the margins of American society. And so in many ways, it was quite logical for a poetic talent like Leroy Jones to become friends with these beat poets. And he does. And so he publishes and edits this literary journal, Eugen, with his wife. He co-publishes and co-edits. He meets a woman named Hetty Cohen at the Record Changer, and they eventually get married in 1958, and they have 2 kids, Kelly and Lisa. Okay. Early influential publications. So from 1961 to 1965, Barakah goes from an obscure avant-garde poet to a well-respected jazz critic, poet, author, and social commentator. And so these are just some of his more well-known publications at this time. You see in 1961 and 1964, he publishes his first 2 volumes of poetry, preface to a 20-volume suicide note and The Dead Lecturer. He publishes an ethno-historical criticism called Blues People, Negro Music in White America in 1963. And this is a book-length treatment of African American music and cultural expression in the United States since Reconstruction. So he traces the development and the trajectory of the blues, jazz, and R&B, since Reconstruction up until the time he's writing in the early 1960s. He also is a dramatist. He writes a lot of plays, his most famous being Dutchman in 1964. And he also publishes a book of social essays called Home in 1965. So, let's see. So Barakah's career as a Black political activist effectively begins in 1961, following the assassination of the democratically elected Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Patrice Lumumba, pictured here. He was murdered on January 7th, 1961. Now, although it couldn't be objectively proven at the time, many suspected the United States was behind the assassination of Lumumba. And it turned out to be correct. The United States and both Belgium had clear plans through the CIA to assassinate Patrice Lumumba. It was called Operation Barracuda. Now, so with this assassination of Lumumba, Amiri Baraka and a lot of African Americans in the United States, they're outraged. They're outraged. Now, why are they outraged? Because what's going on at this time on the African continent and throughout the world is called decolonization. What's decolonization? Well, in the 19th century, early 20th century, European descended nations had effectively colonized 85% of the Earth's surface, right? Africa, Southeast Asia, subcontinental Asia, India, etc. And so following World War II, these great Western powers were weakened economically, and nationalist activists like Lumumba, Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam trying to kick out the French, Gandhi kicking out the British, right? This is a wave of decolonization with these quote unquote third world countries advocating for their own freedom and for their own liberation. And so Lumumba, so in the Congo, they had kicked out the Belgians. And so less than 6 months after the first election where Lumumba assumes power in the country, he's assassinated by Western powers. And so there's outrage across the world. Now, it's important to note that for Leroy Jones, the previous summer in 1960, he had gone to Cuba as part of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Now, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee was a human rights organization dedicated to protecting the people of Cuba and also the Castro regime, the Castro administration led by Fidel Castro. Now, why would they need to do that? Well, before 1959, before Fidel Castro came to power in Cuba, Cuba was effectively run by American sugar corporations. The leader of Cuba was a dictator named Fulgencio Batista, and he was a brutal dictator, and he was obscenely wealthy. And so for most Cubans, they struggled for decades under the rule of Batista. And he was supported by the US. He was supported by the US military. Why would the US support him? Well, because they wanted their corporations to make as much money as possible. And so Baraka learned about this during his travels in Cuba in 1960. And he begins to make these international connections. He says, hey, my experience as a Black youth growing up in Newark, I was discriminated against. That's one thing. But then I see the civil rights movement going on in the American South, Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, that's another thing. But he also sees what's going on in Cuba and sees American interference in that country. Combine that with the murder of Lumumba, and he begins to see white supremacy as not just a local thing, but a global thing that has to be contested. And so the assassination of Lumumba really radicalizes Baraka in many ways, and it shifts him into political activism. And you can see in this quote, he says, "We identified especially with the new nations of Africa. Malcolm X had sounded that note early, and the assassination of Patrice Lumumba touched the African-American intellectual and artist community at the point where nerve touched the bone." So understanding Black liberation movements in the 20th century, you have to understand the murder of Patrice Lumumba. Now, UN protests. So most significantly, perhaps, the murder, or just as significantly, the murder of Lumumba in many ways begins to consolidate African-American identity away from white derived terms such as Negro or colored person in favor of the Pan-African term Afro-American, or what we would call African American today. So, as I said before, Lumumba's death sparked a wave of international protest. You have protests at United Nations and Belgian embassies, because that's who they held responsible, and that's ultimately who was responsible, the United States and Belgium, for assassinating Lumumba. So you have protests at these embassies occurring in Kinshasa, the capital of the Democratic Republic of Congo, to Belgrade, to Cairo, to London, Vienna, Warsaw, Moscow, New Delhi, Tel Aviv, Oslo, and New York City. So in New York City, on 61, this Black History Month, right? So 61 years ago yesterday was this protest. On February 15th, 1961, the Cultural Association of Women of African Heritage organized and led a major protest at UN headquarters in New York. Now, Amiri Baraka was chief among them, right? It was the first political protest he had ever attended, right? And so the demonstrators, and I want to draw your attention to one key thing. The demonstrators marched from First Avenue towards Manhattan chanting, "Congo yes, Yankee no. The word Negro has got to go. We're Afro-Americans." And so in this call and response, we can see that these protests symbolize an emergent new Black identity featuring an international consciousness of anti-racism and anti-colonialism. And these protests reveal that African Americans like Leroy Jones were taking ownership in their naming and how they self-identified, doing so not out of isolated North American politics. This was not just about the civil rights movement, but in the broader context of both the Cuban Revolution, repurposing the revolution slogan, Cuba sí, Yankee no, right? And the African decolonization movement. So what this episode reveals is that the civil rights movement is taking place amidst a larger global backdrop of decolonization. And this decolonization movements inform a lot of the Black political activism of the 1950s and 60s. Look no further than Leroy Jones, who was arrested on this day for the first time in his life at this protest. I should say that he changed his name to Amiri Baraka in 1968. So I will go back and forth between referring to him as Baraka and Jones, but Jones, especially before 1968. So I'm trying not to confuse you too much. But so at this point, he was still known as Leroy Jones. Early activism and organizing. So while Leroy Jones was becoming a household name for his literary success, he is also becoming increasingly politically engaged in the Black freedom struggle. So he began to join a few organizations, such as the Organization of Young Men, On Guard Committee for Freedom. And these were small organizations. And like the Organization of Young Men, it was basically a group of African-American men who got together at a coffee shop or a bar, and they just talked about Martin Luther King, Patrice Lumumba, anything that was going on in the world at that time, whether it was civil rights or decolonization, just trying to raise their own political consciousness about what was going on in the world. And so Baraka also officially joins the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. That was the committee that originally sponsored his trip to Cuba in the summer of 1960. And he eventually becomes the New York chairman by the end of 1961. And so now the historian Van Gossi captures some of this tension in his life when he describes Baraka leading a, quote, double life as both poet and activist. So what does Van Gossi mean about double life? Well, on one hand, Baraka, or as he was known as Leroy Jones, he begins to lead two different lives. He's married to a white woman. He has two interracial children. The majority of his friends are white beatniks, and he's thriving in that world. On the other hand, he's becoming engaged in the Black freedom struggle, making friends with more Black jazz musicians, making friends with more Black civil rights advocates like Robert Williams. And so there's this tension in his life between 1961 and 1965. And this tension permeates his life during the 1960s. So by 1964, at 29 years of age, he finds himself entering what Langston Hughes called the Jones year. What's the Jones year? It's a watershed year of prolific creative output that would make Leroy Jones a household name. As I said before, he published Dead Lecturer, the anthology, the collection of poems in 1964. He also published 4 plays, but most famous was Dutchman. It won an Off-Broadway award, an Obie, for Best Play of the Year in 1964. So he was becoming very popular and successful. And so much so that the Sunday Herald Tribune writer, Isabella Eberstadt, described Jones as a critic, a celebrity, a king of the Lower East Side. Okay. All right. So the assassination of Malcolm X marked a dramatic turning point in the life of Amiri Baraka. So Malcolm X was murdered on February 21st, 1965. He was assassinated at the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem. Now, the death of Malcolm transformed Baraka from avant-garde poet to militant black nationalist almost overnight. In fact, the very next day, February 22nd, he announced plans to open the Black Arts Repertory Theater and School in Harlem. And he would do that in a matter of months. And so in 1965, after Malcolm X dies, he leaves his wife, Hetty, and their 2 children in Greenwich, in the East Village, I should say, and moved uptown to Harlem to open the Black Arts Repertory Theater and School. As the late historian Manning Marable argues, to Baraka, Malcolm represented a Black aesthetic, a set of values and criteria for cultural representations that affirm the genius and creativity of people of African descent. And Malcolm provided the template for what Black artists should aspire to achieve, end quote. So I bring this up because it's important to understand that Amiri Baraka sees himself as carrying the torch of Pan-African liberation that was started by Malcolm X in the 1960s or 1950s, depending on how far you want to go back. So the Black Arts Repertory Theater and School, also known as BARTS, and the Black Arts Movement. So while relatively short-lived, BARTS would inspire a national Black arts movement. The movement leads to an explosion of Black intellectual and creative expression, a variety of Black presses, publishing houses, journals, and drama houses, from Ujima in Buffalo to Black Arts West in San Francisco, to Afrocobra in Chicago, to Black Arts South in New Orleans, all the way back to Spirit House in Newark. You also see literary developments, establishment in California's Bay Area of the Journal of Black Poetry and the Black Scholar. In Chicago, we see the foundation of the Negro Digest and the Third World Press. And in Detroit, we see the foundation of the Broadside Press and Lotus Press. So these cultural institutions function to incubate the rising tide of Black pride as reproduced in Black art throughout the United States. So Baraka's personal development of all Black cultural and political institutions remains one of his most significant contributions to Black culture and political life in the United States today. Spirit House. So Baraka's performative and institutional approach to building Black political consensus was rooted in bringing historical pride in being Black back to the forefront of the Black urban working class consciousness of the United States. And so you see, founded in 1966, Spirit House, I should say, after the Black Arts Repertory Theater and School closed in December of 65, Leroy Jones leaves Harlem and moves back home to Newark. So in the new year, he established the Spirit House, much like Bart's. Located in the heart of Newark Central Ward, Spirit House was a theater and multi-purpose community center, home to the Spirit House Movers and Players cultural troupe. And as you see in this picture, taken from one of the magazines that Baraka published called Black Newark, in the very bottom, you can see the phrase, Black spirit to raise the race. And I'll come back to that in just a second. The Barakah family. In 1966, Baraka marries Amina Baraka, and the two helped to reorganize Black political consciousness in this country. So now Amina Baraka had long been a Newark-based activist, artist, organizer, and leader independent of her husband. So she wielded tremendous influence within the cultural organizations that they instituted and collaborated in. She, for her part, well, let's just say married in 66, they have 5 children: Ras, Shani, Obalaji, Ahi, and Amiri Jr. So while he established Bart's and Spirit House, she established the African Free School in 1967, and also began the Black Women's United Front, a political organization, in 1974. So the African Free School was a liberation school. It was known as a liberation school, teaching Black youth about the positive aspects of African American and African history. Because now there's some debate about what's being taught in schools today, and this has been ongoing in this country. And 50 years ago, Black history was not being taught in schools. And so it was up to parents like the Barakas. They felt that they had to educate their own children about the historical greatness of Black people, because that history was intentionally being left out of the history books. Again, an issue that's still in play today. So the Black aesthetic. The effort to inspire, educate, and move the Black masses was the underlying ethos of what came to be known as the Black aesthetic. So Barakah almost single-handedly, and he doesn't do it by himself, there's thousands of people, but through the establishment of the Black Arts Repertory Theater in schools, he almost single-handedly establishes an aesthetic demand that would transform African-American cultural expression. His polyrhythmic staccato poetic style was based on urban Black street vernacular. This is a forerunner to rapping and hip hop that you would see about 5 years later. And to sum up the Black aesthetic in one phrase, it's this idea that Black is beautiful. Again, African Americans weren't being taught their history in public schools, right? And again, it might be hard to imagine today in 2022, but 60 years ago, African Americans, we were still living in a segregated society, North and South, and African Americans were viewed as second-class people. And they were pictured in popular media as in racist stereotypes, as dumb and stupid and lazy. And so it was really quite a radical act to portray Black people as three-dimensional, loving, courageous, smart, beautiful, right? And this is really the genius of the Black arts movement. It's a cultural revolution inside this country for Black people to say, I'm African American, I'm Black and I'm proud, right? This was something that was not being said 10 years prior, right? Uhuru. Uhuru means freedom. The Black aesthetic speaks to the idea or the larger Black arts project of correcting Black consciousness by providing Africanist aesthetic ideals, of lifting up the African American people out of mainstream American discourse, which teaches Black people that they are second class and thus unworthy of the full rights of citizenship. So, Uhuru was a painting by Nelson Stevens. He was a member of the Afro Cobra commune based in Chicago that was founded in 1968, a Black arts adjacent commune, right, organization. And this painting is called Uhuru. Uhuru is Swahili for freedom. And I'll let his colleague, artist Barbara Jones Hogu, describe the mission of Afro Cobra. And I'm going to read this brief quote because it summarizes the mission of the Black arts movement in many ways. The visual statement must be humanistic, with the figure frontal and direct to stress strength. The subject matter must be completely understood to the viewer, therefore requiring lettering to clarify the visual statement. The visual statement must identify our problems and offer a solution, a pattern of behavior or attitude. The visual statement must educate. It must speak of our past, present, or future, and make Black, positive, direct statements created in bright, vivid, singing, Kool-Aid colors of strawberry, orange, cherry, lemon, lime, and grape. And so in this painting here by Nelson Stevens, you see not all of these tenets of Afro Cobra, but you see a lot of them, bright colors, depicting Black people as beautiful. You have a picture of an African-American woman, and perhaps she's looking off into the distance, and she's imagining freedom for her people, right? The Uhuru over her head, right, symbolizes her thought, right? If you want to achieve freedom, you have to think about it, you have to visualize it. And this is very much the work of the Black arts movement. To educate, uplift, organize, and mobilize, right? That's the idea behind the Black arts movement. To educate, uplift, organize, and mobilize. And so the Black arts movement was not just a cultural movement, it was a political movement, right? And so Black arts was intent on Black power. And for Barakah, this came to mean a Black political demand for community control or self-determination or sovereignty for African Americans in neighborhoods, communities, towns, and cities where they made up the majority population, right? So to quote his friend Larry Neal, a fellow Black arts activist, artist, and organizer, Larry Neal said, Black art is the aesthetic and spiritual sister of the Black power concept. So if Black power was a political movement that followed after the civil rights movement, Black arts was complementary to that, right? Educate the masses, teach Black people about their greatness, and then have them move and organize in a direction for Black liberation in Newark, in the United States, on the African continent, global liberation. Now, the situation in Newark in the 1960s was anything but Black liberation. By 1967, Black Newarkers found themselves the majority population of the city, yet they lacked access to wealth generation and any positions of power within local corporations and city government. They found themselves within a proverbial prison made of brick walls, right? AKA Brick City. I will explain in just a second. So after World War II, the Federal Housing Administration guaranteed low-cost mortgages to returning soldiers. Now, the FHA redlined nearly all of Newark. Now, what is redlining? To put it very briefly, redlining just means real estate companies, the federal government established that an all-white neighborhood is the safest investment. An integrated neighborhood, an all-Black neighborhood, is a risk. Therefore, we should not invest in interracial neighborhoods or all-Black neighborhoods, right? Only all-white neighborhoods would be publicly financed by the government, right, through the establishment of these mortgages, right? And so since the FHA redlined nearly all of Newark, not all of it, but almost all of it, saying we can't invest in Newark because it's predominantly Black and Puerto Rican, it's risky, we're only going to insure mortgages in the suburbs. Well, white people moved to the suburbs, right? And for years, many African Americans weren't allowed to move into suburbs. They were segregated. Now that changed by 1968, but until 1968, segregation remained law, the de facto norm. Let's see. So now, under the auspices of urban renewal, the 1950s saw the construction of 4 vertical ghettos in Newark: Scudder Homes, Stella Wright Homes, Hayes Homes, and Columbus Homes. Pictured Hayes Homes right here, breaking ground in 1954. Now, these public housing projects are also known as vertical ghettos, and they're public housing, which means if you rent, you don't develop equity. Your nest egg, your economic nest egg is non-existent. Whereas if you own a single family home out in Montclair or Bloomfield or West Orange, right, you can generate generational wealth, right? And so wealth in this country is very much a racializing process, and we see it happening in Newark. Let's see. Now, last thing I want to say, between 1934 and 1968, $120 billion was spent by the US government in financing home mortgages. Less than 2% went to people of color. So what's going on in Leroy Jones's backyard of Newark, New Jersey, is not an isolated situation, right? It's a national phenomenon where wealth is being subsidized in the white suburbs, and for people of color living in the cities, they're not being invested in, right? They're getting vertical ghettos, which become dens of crime and drug use. This leads to the Newark Uprising in the summer of 1967. So the conditions that led to the Newark Uprising would ultimately lead to Black electoral success in the city of Newark. So between 1950 and 1967, the white population of Newark dropped from about 350,000 to 150,000, while the Black population tripled, 70,000 to over 200,000. Again, white folks were moving to the suburbs, subsidized by the government. Black folks were moving north, coming from the south still, right? And most of these suburbs were segregated. Most of the cities were segregated informally. And so they couldn't just move to an integrated neighborhood. They had to move to the Central Ward. They had to move to the Stella Wright housing projects or the Hayes Homes housing projects. And so despite the enormous reduction of Newark's white population, positions of property ownership, corporate business, and political power remained exclusively in white hands. So for example, by 1967, the year of the rebellion, 90% of Newark's police force was white, while 60% of its population was Black. And through this state-sponsored disinvestment of redlining and subsidization of suburbanization, between 1958 and 1970, Newark would suffer the loss of over 20,000 manufacturing jobs. 40,000 of Newark's 130,000 housing units were classified as substandard or dilapidated. These were the conditions that led to the Newark Rebellion in 1967. So what do you see here? So we have here in this picture, the Hayes Homes housing project right here in blue, Stella Homes pointed out in black, and you have the 4th precinct of the Newark Police Department situated right between the two. Now you might have heard in the last couple of years that the way police communities of color in this country is far different than the way they police white communities. And this is a profound example of what it looked like in the 1960s, right? You build housing projects and you put a police station in the middle of those housing projects. So as soon as one young Black person makes a mistake, the police are on top of them. But so 4th precinct. So how did the riot begin? Black cab driver John Smith was pulled over and was beaten by the police in front of this 4th precinct police station right here. Now, there's crowds, there's Black folks outside these housing projects. They see what's going on. They become enraged. They interject to save this man's life because he was being beaten to death. And they're throwing bottles, rocks, everything they could throw at the cops to save the guy. And this sets off a week-long wave of violence, right? Newark Rebellion. You even see here, this is Leroy Jones, beaten that night, driving. He was pulled out of his car, arrested for suspicion of possessing a handgun. Those charges were curiously later dropped, but he was beaten, bloody, right? As you can see by the crack over his head and the blood-stained shirt, right? And so, Barakah would go on to publish these pamphlets for his magazine saying, "Stop killer cops," right? Your child may be next. So we should all know by today in 2022, following the summer of George Floyd protests that this nation saw, that police brutality is nothing new in Black communities, right? And unfortunately, Amiri Barakah lived it, right? So the Committee for Unified Newark, Amiri Barakah and the Committee for Unified Newark. So in 1968, Amiri Barakah changes his name to the Arabic name, Blessed Prince. Barakah means blessed, Amiri means prince. Changes his name to Amiri Barakah in 1968. And following the Newark Uprising, he establishes the Committee for Unified Newark, CFUN, to establish seeking community control, right? It's a Black-dominated city, yet somehow white people have all the levers of power, right? So how can we change that? Well, Barakah was called many things: radical, controversial, all kinds of things. But one thing he practiced was practical politics, electoral liberal politics. And so he established his Black Newark Political Convention, and they endorsed a slate of candidates to run for the city commission. Now, all of those candidates in 68 lost, right? But the losses they suffered in 1968 paved the way for electoral success in 1970. Community control in the Congress of African People. So in 1970, we see the first Black mayor of Newark elected, Kenneth Gibson, right? And Barakah organized, Gibson's successful campaign was organized by Barakah, who was able to consolidate a multiracial coalition. So whereas in 1968, he had just a Black political convention, in 69, he has a Black and Puerto Rican convention. Now, African Americans and Puerto Ricans made up almost 75% of the population in Newark in 1969. So Barakah said, we need to bring the Puerto Ricans into this coalition, and if we can get them to support Gibson, we can take over, right? And that's essentially what happens, right? So Barakah is hailed for his grassroots organizing efforts, and the Congress of African People, a national organization, saw Newark as the model for Black indigenous control. So much so that by 1972, Amiri Barakah was elected chairman of the Congress of African people. Now, big picture, what the victory for Gibson symbolizes a larger process of Black mayors being elected across the country. You see it in Cleveland, Carl Stokes in 1967. You see it with Richard Hatcher in Gary, Indiana in 1970. As a historical side note, to show you the kind of political corruption of the Italian political machine in Newark before 1970, after the incumbent mayor Hugh Adonisio lost, he went straight to jail, convicted on 60 counts of conspiracy and extortion, and sent to 10 years in prison, right? So this was the kind of corruption that African Americans in Newark had been dealing with. So they voted him out. He goes to jail. Kenneth Gibson comes in. And it symbolizes the rise of Black elected officials throughout the country, post-civil rights. So now the Congress of African People was a national organization that they tried to advance what's called a national Black political agenda. Barakah and leaders like him, they wanted to form a national Black political party to consolidate their political power. Don't become a Republican, don't become a Democrat. Let's have a Black political party, right? We want to consolidate our power. Let's come up with a national Black political party. Well, these efforts ultimately failed because at the same time, Black leaders were finding mainstream success as Republicans and Democrats, not only as mayors, but also in Congress, right? So, Newark and Industrialization. So Black power had proven to be tremendously successful on a local level and at the level of electoral success, but structural issues remained. So these new leaders like Stokes, Gibson, Hatcher, they faced the dire consequences of suburbanization and deindustrialization. What do you do when your white tax base moves out? What do you do when the corporations get shipped to the suburbs where now white people are living, or to foreign countries such as Bangladesh or China, right? So what do you do? And so these quotes by Hatcher represent this problem. Hatcher says, and I quote, "You can be very Black and unified in Gary, but your home, your life, your patronage, and your political future depend really on how well you fit into the pattern of a very white regional machine." Next quote, he goes on to say, "There is much talk about Black control of the ghetto. I am a mayor of a city of roughly 90,000 Black people, but we do not control the possibilities of jobs for them, of money for their schools, or state-funded social services. These things are in the hands of the U.S. Steel Corporation and the County Department of Welfare of the state of Indiana." And so what Hatcher is talking about is just because you're successful in these predominantly Black cities, within the larger suburban regions that are largely white, you can't do much politically to help your constituency, right? Their hands are tied in many ways. And so you see this in Newark. By 1974, Newark's property tax base had shrunk 21% since 1963 because the state of New Jersey, like most states, all states within the United States, use property taxes to fund public education. You begin to see tremendous disparities, both budgetary and in education and academic performance, that result in suburban Essex County versus urban Newark. A few more things. By the mid-1970s, Newark's flagship corporations, they left the city, right? Almost 500 companies shut their doors or moved out. 70,000 jobs were lost. Black youth unemployment during this period rose to nearly 50%. In order to stimulate investment, the city granted tax-exempt status to 2/3 of the city, which was reserved for public housing, urban renewal, and private investment. As a result, businesses were paying the same tax rate they had in 1963, while local homeowners bore the brunt of increasing taxation rates. So you have the few Black homeowners left in Newark bearing the brunt of taxation. You have the corporations that remain white run, white dominated. They're paying lower taxes than ever, because if you don't lower the taxes, they're not going to stay, right? So mayors like Gibson find themselves in a catch-22. How do you satisfy your constituency? Well, they didn't do it. For his part, Mayor Gibson proposed a commuter tax, right? If we can have tolls for all the workers that come into the city, we can raise public funds. But the largely white suburbs defeated the proposition in state legislature, right? So even though we think sometimes the city's problems are the city's problems, what these struggles show is that politics works in regional networks, even within a state, right? And so, Kwana Towers. So under Baraka's leadership, the Congress of African People embraced African national leaders, such as Amilcar Cabral and Julius Nyerere, and saw the latter style of African socialism as the most effective strategy to implement community control in Newark. So, following the ideological lead of its chairman, Baraka, CAP's official position on socialism in 1972 advocated for Nyerere's progressive Tanzanian government and its program of Ujamaa, meaning cooperative economics. In fact, Baraka and CAP Newark modeled their proposed North Ward Kwana Towers affordable housing project after Nyerere's Ujamaa villages that sought to improve Tanzanian infrastructure and provide better services to its inhabitants. So you see here, leaders like Baraka are looking to the African continent to say, what's working in Africa? What's working in these African countries like Tanzania and Guinea-Bissau, right? And it works there, so let's try it here. Well, unfortunately, Kwana Towers was a flop for Baraka, namely because there was a protracted labor strike. Simply put, white construction workers refused to break ground on the project because they considered Baraka to be a racist. They didn't like his politics. He was leader of a Black Newark. They wanted nothing to do with him. So they sued, right? This gets tied up in court until 1975. And ultimately, Newark City Hall, the same City Hall run by Kenneth Gibson, votes against the measure. So this would effectively signal the end of Baraka's political influence, simultaneously at a local and a national level. But this was not the end of Baraka. So the next 40 years of his life, he would pass away in 2014. He would identify himself as a socialist, right? He saw how capitalism worked in Newark, not to the detriment of Black people, but too often to the detriment of white people. And like many Pan-African leaders like Cabral and Nyerere, and Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, he advocated for socialism. So he becomes known as a Black Marxist. And during this period, I should say, despite the popular criticism that his turn to socialism produced inferior art, Baraka's creative output over the final 40 years of his life contains some of the strongest work he ever produced. So here's just a list of some of his most famous titles and most rewarded or awarded titles. Okay. Publications, awards, and legacy. So Baraka published in his life 11 volumes of poetry, 11 volumes of drama, 4 works of fiction, 12 works of nonfiction, 6 volumes of edited works. Incredibly prolific cultural output as a writer, right? And he was recognized for his work throughout his life through the Obie Award for Dutchman, a Penn Faulkner Award for the short story collection in 2006, Tales of the Out and the Gone, a Rockefeller Foundation Award for Drama, Langston Hughes Award for the City College of New York. He was awarded fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts. And perhaps controversially, he was named the Poet Laureate of the state of New Jersey in 2002. And his legacy is ultimately, he was a champion of Black people in Newark and throughout the world. And his legacy of poetry and political activism continues to inspire in his efforts to address police brutality in Newark in the 1960s and 70s, regained attention in the last few years, particularly during the summer of 2020 in the George Floyd protests that took place across the country and throughout the world. And lastly, perhaps Amiri Baraka's greatest tangible legacy is that of his son, Ras, the mayor of Newark since 2014. Some of the highlights of Ras Barakas' administration, through an executive order in 2015, he created a highly controversial civilian review board, an independent third party to review between the city and the police department incidents of police brutality, right? Next, he replaced, beginning last year, in September of 21, under his leadership, Newark's been replacing all the lead pipes. So we know about the disaster of lead in the pipes of Flint, Michigan. Well, Newark faced a similar situation, but the way Baraka handled it has been called a national role model by none other than the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris. Ras Baraka, they broke ground on Kwana Towers in March 2021, so just a year ago. So the project that ultimately failed and sunk his dad as a political activist in terms of liberal politics, his son revives 50 years later. And now there's an affordable housing community is being built called Kwana Towers, right? He also has established a land bank initiative, also about a year ago, aided, implemented to aid funding private home ownership for the people of Newark, again, largely Black population. And this summer, he's implementing a youth employment program. Youth employment programs are successful because we know crime tends to rise in the summertime when kids are home from school and they don't have jobs. And just like employment in general, if you employ kids, you keep them off the streets. So you can see how just some of these policies that Mayor Ras Barakas has implemented are direct descendants in the spirit and the attitude of the cultural work and the political work that his father implemented over the course of his life through the Black Arts Movement and the Black Power movement. So that is all I have to say. Thank you very much for your time. And if you have any questions, I'll defer to Dr. Shin, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Clavin, for a wonderful and insightful talk. Well, now is the time to ask questions to Dr. Clavin. And as I explained earlier, if you'd like to ask a question, simply type question in the chat box. Or if you'd like to ask a question but don't want to unmute yourself, you can type your question in the chat box. Well, since there hasn't been a question yet, I am going to ask a question myself. So I have invited my students here, Competition 2 students here, and we just read James Baldwin's Son is Blues, and I briefly introduced Barakah's blues people to them. So could you explain the significance of blues people to especially African-American jazz musicians like Sonny?
Okay, great question. So, well, blues people is arguably the most successful publication Barakah has ever had, right? Because at this time he was very popular in the white world, right? And he was popular in the Black community as well. That changed over the course of his life. But so 1963, he was, it was right before the Jones year. He was at the apex of, white Western cultural import. And so blues people was important because he comes up with this concept of the changing sane. And he traces the rise of Black cultural expression is tied to white political repression. And it's kind of like this feedback loop of whenever you see Black folks gaining some civil rights, some achievements in this country, you always see backlash by white folks. You always see trying to contain Black folks, right? And so what blues people describes is how blues comes about from post-Reconstruction Jim Crow and racist terrorist violence and convict leasing policies, right? Jazz, and so it's kind of like the spirit of the times. And jazz captures the Great Migration, African Americans moving north, gaining jobs, making money, escaping the terrorist violence of the South. And so jazz becomes the spirit of the times in that it becomes very hopeful, right? And it's obviously encapsulated in the Harlem Renaissance, right? The writings of Langston Hughes and music of Duke Ellington. And then Barakah's writing about the new jazz, hard bop in the 1950s, John Coltrane, but also R&B, such as the Supremes, Otis Redding, and R&B reflecting the spirit of the life that they lived in, which was global decolonization, right? Black liberation movements, civil rights movements, dancing in the streets. That song, it's a great dance song, but it's about protests in the streets, right? It's about the Black freedom struggle. Even though it's got a catchy jingle, it's actually about the Black freedom struggle in the 1960s, as interpreted by Martha and the Vandellas in Detroit, Michigan. And so as it relates to Sonny's Blues, I think, you would see Sonny trying to find redemption, right, through his musical career and his battles with drug addiction, right, and so what Barakah identifies in blues people is that art comes from the conditions of the people, right, whether you're Black or white, red, or whatever, right, art comes from the lived experience of the people. And so Black cultural expression in this country comes from, unfortunately, experiences with oppression, right? Pained experiences of discrimination and violence, right? And so Sonny's struggle with heroin or whatever drug he was on was symbolic of the struggle that Charlie Parker faced, right? Charlie Parker, arguably the greatest saxophonist in American history, right? And so I think Baldwin would tell you that Sonny kind of Baldwin uses Sonny as kind of a, models him after Charlie Parker. But so the struggles that Sonny was going through was not just drug addiction because he was an idiot. It was drug addiction because he was living in a segregated society where white men called you a boy, right? You were more likely to be unemployed. You didn't make as much money as white people, and so you were a second-class citizen. And so how do people internalize that struggle? Well, a lot of people internalize it through drugs and alcohol and domestic violence. But for people like Malcolm X, for people like Amiri Baraka, they externalize it and they say, this is not the way to go. We need to preach about our historical strength as being denied to us, and we need to find redemption through the way we express ourselves. So I think, Sonny playing the piano at the end of that story is, it's very much, championing the virtue of Black cultural expression that you would see that's championed during the Black arts movement of the 1960s and 70s.
Thank you very much. And I have received 2 more questions. In the meantime, I'm going to introduce in the order that I received. Dr. Scholler was asking, thank you for the wealth of information, Peter. How do the remarks Baraka made after 9/11 fit into his legacy?
Oh, great question. So for those of you who don't know, after 9/11, he published a poem called Somebody Blew Up America. And the poem was largely about the oppression caused by Western imperialism, from the assassination of Lumumba to Jim Crow lynchings of Black people in the American South to the genocide of Jews and Armenians in Europe and in the Middle East, right? But he did embrace a conspiracy theory. In the poem, he said, why did Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon tell the Israeli workers in the Twin Towers to not come to work that day? This ties into a conspiracy theory that Ariel Sharon knew, and that 9/11 was an inside job, and it was somehow instigated by Israel. And it delves into this, and quickly, as you can see, this would delve into some ugly anti-Semitic overtones, right? And so now part of Baraka's controversial legacy is that in the 1960s, he published some misogynistic, anti-Semitic, hate whitey kind of rhetoric, right? As a militant Black nationalist, right? Now he would, in the 70s, he would come out and apologize for that writing, right? But that tends to get overlooked. So now his comments or the poem that he published post 9/11, I think it's important to understand that not to excuse Baraka for his behavior or his awful anti-Semitic or misogynistic language, but to understand that's one part of the person. And when you study history, you have to understand that most people are complicated, and good people do bad things and bad people do good things. And it's hard to determine if someone's a good person or a bad person because they commit a lot of harmful acts and they do a lot of good things, right? And so I'm not trying to absolve Baraka of any of that hateful rhetoric. But I think what many people would do is they would strip him of the state poet laureate position of New Jersey, right? And they would try and silence him and say, this guy's just a crazy anti-Semitic, white-hating Black person. But that reduces Baraka to a one-dimensional caricature, right? And when you do that, you tend to fall into these white supremacist stereotypes of Black people as reactionary, violent, right, criminal. And so I'm not saying there's not merit to critiques of Baraka. There absolutely is legitimate critiques of the language and the rhetoric that he used, predominantly in the 1960s and 70s. But that poem touched a nerve, and he paid the price, right? The governor of New Jersey they couldn't remove him from the position, so they just abolished the position in toto. So as I like to call him, he was the final state poet laureate for New Jersey.
Thank you very much.
Great question, Ken.
Another question from Dr. James Ponzo is that I missed the beginning of the lecture, but I was wondering with the recent documentary Who Killed Malcolm X and the special exonerated that aired a few weeks ago and the connections to Newark, New Jersey. What was the impact of Malcolm X on Barakah?
Well, I had a slide dedicated for that, Dr. Ponzo. No, so the Barakah basically was radicalized almost overnight, right? Malcolm X was killed on February 21st. The anniversary is coming up, next week? And literally the day after, on February 22nd, Barakah held a press conference and announced his intention to open the Black Arts Repertory Theater and School in Harlem. And he would move to Harlem, right? And he would, unceremoniously ditch his white wife and move to Harlem 2 months later and start the Black Arts Repertory Theater and School. And so, as I said during the presentation, Barakah very much saw himself as carrying the torch of the legacy of Malcolm X. And when Malcolm X was killed, Barakah was in a bookstore at a poetry reading, and he felt guilty about it, right? He felt that he betrayed Malcolm for not being there by his side, right? And how could this, shining black prince be shot down and I didn't do anything to help him? I wasn't there to help. And so Barakah internalizes his guilt and externalizes as a militant black nationalist, and starts the Black Arts movement, kicks off the Black Arts movement with the Black Arts Repertory Theater and School. So in many ways, you could call Amiri Barakah a literary Malcolm X.
Thank you very much. And I have another question from one of our students, Miss Sabrina Rogers. She's asking, does his art and buildings that he created for Black art still exist? Can we go and see the theater there?
The Black Arts Repertory Theater. So I have been there. It still exists. It's not in use. Well, shoot, I was there about 10 years ago, and it was like an after school music program. I forget, I have a picture of it somewhere in my collection of photos. I wish I had it. But it's still kind of an art space. It's basically the building. It's the basement of a classic traditional Harlem brownstone. So people still live in the building, right? It's just all apartments. But in the basement, there's, it's kind of like where the custodian lives or where the super lives. But it's just a larger performance space. And it functions as an after school music destination for the kids of Harlem. Now, as for Spirit House in New Jersey, in Newark, that does not exist anymore. Interesting fact about Spirit House, it was actually the home of Amiri and Amina Barakah. It was a 3-story house with a basement. They lived on the top floor, right? So they literally turned their house into a community space. So now that house, 33 Sterling Street, I think it was demolished. I don't think Sterling Street exists. I've tried to find it on maps, but they've done some redistricting and, things have happened. So the Black Arts Theater brownstone is still there. You can see the space at the address 130. You can still see it. Unfortunately, Spirit House does not exist. But Amina Barakah still lives in their house in South Newark, and Ras is in the mayoral's office. So the movement still lives on through Ras and others.
That was a great question. Thank you, Sabrina. And another question comes, and as you perhaps know, Dr. Clavin, an original Legacy Project speaker was Hattie Jones, who was married to Barakah during the Beat generation. Mm-hmm. And she opened up in the lecture about the difficulty of finding space and voice as a woman within the male-dominated literary movement. And you covered this, but could you expand on how Barakah felt about the Beat generation, of which he was a part of, because it was male-dominated, but also white-dominated?
Well, it's interesting, right? So a lot of Black nationalists like Barakah are accused, and rightfully so, of being misogynistic, right? And rightfully so. He tried to put his wife in a submissive position, and Amina basically just wasn't having it, right? She never tolerated it. They constantly fought. And she always stood up for herself, right? And exerted her agency, right? But we tend to look at Black nationalists and say they all subjugated, they put women in inferior positions. But the Beat movement was much the same way, right? We live in a patriarchal society. So a lot of the beat poets were extremely misogynistic, right? And the women weren't allowed to often participate, or sometimes they were allowed to participate, but they would go last. Or all the guys would sit at one table and all the girls would sit at another table. So unfortunately, the misogyny that Barakah might display later on as a Black nationalist, you could say he very much learned it, not just from the beats, but from his time in the military in Puerto Rico. So, but to your question, now there was one other point I wanted to make. What was the question again?
Like how Barakah felt about the Beat generation, of which he was a part of, because
right. So thank you. So how he felt about it. So even as he became a militant Black nationalist, he maintained correspondence with one of his best friends, a white poet named Ed Dorn, who lived in Idaho. So even as he was saying, I hate white people, right? He still was friends with Ginsberg and Kerouac and Ed Dorn, right? In fact, when Barakah went to jail after he was brutalized during the rebellion of 1967, it was Allen Ginsberg who flew in from San Francisco to exert political pressure on the city of Newark to release Barakah. So Barakah, I mean, I can't say those relationships weren't strained. They absolutely were strained, right? But he maintained his friendships with many of those white poets throughout his life. Unfortunately for Hetty, and he maintained a relationship with Hetty. The narrative is that he moved to Harlem and left his wife, and that was it. But he would go back, even when he was living in Harlem, he would visit on the weekends to spend time with the kids, right? So the popular narrative is that he couldn't stand Hetty Cohen because she was white and she was Jewish, right? But it couldn't be further from the truth, right? Now, did they have a strained relationship? Did they divorce? Absolutely. And it was hard for Hetty to deal with that, right? But understandably so. But he took care of his kids as much as he could, right? And he maintained pragmatic relationships with many of the people of his formative years growing up in Newark. In Greenwich Village in the 50s and 60s. Great question. Thank you for asking.
Thank you very much. Is there any other question? Well, thank you, Dr. Clavin, and thank you all for your very engaging questions. I think we have to just finish here, but before you go, let me briefly remind you of the commemoration committee's upcoming events. One second, let me just pull out the screen right here. Right here. Okay. So we're co-sponsoring If These Stones Could Talk, a conversation about New Jersey's African American history with the Legacy Project and the official Office of Special Events on February 22nd, again, commemorating Black History Month. It's an online discussion with local historians, Beverly Mills and Elaine Buck. We'll talk about their book, If These Stones Could Talk. The book sheds light on a forgotten corner of American history that begins in a small cemetery in central New Jersey. And on February 21st, we will celebrate the International Mother Language Day by doing a Padlet activity with CCM professor, Dr. Mariam Alikani. And as for March, we are commemorating Women's History Month on March 3rd with CCM professor Deborah Hofflinger on the life and legacy of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. On March 22nd, we will co-sponsor with the Legacy Project and the Office of Special Events and invite Dr. Nancy Unger to talk about the role that gender has played in environmental history based on our new book, Beyond Nature's Housekeepers, American Women in Environmental History. If you're interested in these events, please RSVP by sending us an email at commemoration@ccm.edu. Please also follow us on Instagram and Twitter to stay up to date with our events and news. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful day, everybody.
All right, thanks for coming out, everybody.